All right, let's stay with the story joining us now. We hope that Federations of Union of South Africa, Cecily Benjamin, will be joining us, but we are in studio with South African Federation of Trade Unions, Zwelinzima Vavi, and Labour analyst, Adrew Levy. Gentlemen, a very good evening to you. Zweli, let me start with you in studio. A very good evening and thank you so much. But just your take on the clip that we've just heard now from Africa Tikkun saying that as good as this move of the minimum wage is, it might affect job creation.
Well, everything is job sensitive. You cannot close your eyes and refuse to look at the consequences of every policy in South Africa, as much as you do it when you look at the ILO conventions and the Constitution of South Africa. Everything is job sensitive, and so we must acknowledge that. In our view, we have to enter into this debate in its total context. And here's a context to the discussion. South Africa has been colonized for almost 400 years by the superpowers of Europe. And as part of that colonialization, it meant that you keep the wages of black workers who were seen as just part of the machines, not as workers, until late 1967, when for the first time they recognized the so-called coloureds as workers, and until 1979, when they regarded the Africans, or so-called Africans, as workers. Before that, they were just tools. So there was a systematic strategy to keep the wages very, very low as part of creating this large labor reserve to continue with the extraction of our minerals to Europe, where they will create real jobs whilst they're leaving the greater majority of South African workers languishing in very low, unskilled jobs. So there's a history to this. So the wages of farm workers in particular, but also the wages of other, what you will regard as the more vulnerable sectors of workers, cleaning, security, domestic workers, and so forth, became the face of that very low wage strategy pursued by the colonial masters who were exploiting South Africa's mineral resources. We cannot forget that context. But there's also a second context. The world have been liberalizing. They have been driving what we normally call a neoliberal strategy, in that if you look at the impact of that even in the entire world of the developed nations, the wages of workers have been declining since 1970. But if you look at the developing countries, which include South Africa, let's look at particularly South Africa, the wages of workers have been declining since 1990. This is what is creating a big gap between ordinary workers and their managers in all sectors of the economy. And that's then the driving force behind the growing inequalities that have made South Africa the most unequal society in the entire world. So if you do not take those factors into consideration, you're more likely to fall into a trap of somebody that will say, we're likely to lose 100, 1,000 jobs here and there, so let's rather keep the status quo as arranged by the colonial masters intact, because we fear that there may be 100 jobs that are lost in one farm.
All right. We'll get to that. Let me introduce the two gentlemen. We are joined also by Saftus Benjamin of FEDUSA, the Deputy Secretary General. We also have Adrew Levy, Labour analyst, on the line with us. Andrew, let me come to you. And just at first glance, this progress that has been made, if one can put it that way, of the national minimum wage that since it came in effect in 2019. Just your take on the steps that have been taken to where we are right now.
Right. Well, good evening, and thank you. Look, I must say at the outset that I'm not sure that I agree with Comrade Vavi's analysis of low wages. And to say that it's the result of 400 years of colonial masters seems to make the assumption that for 400 years South Africa was an industrial economy at a time when no country in the world was an industrial economy. But be that as it may, equally I need to take issue on this frequently quoted statistic that we are the most unequal country in the world. We're not. The stats don't show that. We may be round about number 13, and that is absolutely nothing to be proud of. And I don't dispute that we have a large disparity, but we have a large disparity everywhere in the world, and it is growing. So I think we just need to put those things into focus. Now, just to move on for a moment, the promise or the need for a national minimum wage in South Africa is a matter of government policy. And I don't think that anybody can argue against the concept of a national minimum wage. Most of the developed economies in the Western world, which don't necessarily include the economies that Comrade Vavi approves of, most of them, if not all of them, have national minimum wages. And there's no doubt that this is a matter of economic policy. It's a matter of government policy to protect the lower earnings. The question is not so much whether we should have a national minimum wage. The question is what level should the national minimum wage be set at in order not necessarily to lose jobs because of the elasticity of demand for labor. Now, this is not a simple question, as any labor economist like myself will tell you. There are many variables involved here. So I think in looking at the South African national minimum wage, and we need to bear in mind when it comes to wages and our labor market, ours is a highly regulated labor market. We have bargaining councils, we have employment sectoral standards, we have a national minimum wage. It is hardly a free labor market in that respect. Now, national minimum wages are there to provide some bottom line, as it were, some kind of protective floor. From that point of view, socially, politically desirable. The question is, at what level should we set it? And I'm sure that that is a point that we'll come back to in the course of this debate.
Sure. Ashley, a very good evening to you. And also to start off, from your perspective, your take on the announcement made by the Minister?
Good evening to you and good evening to the viewers. FEDUSA welcomes the announcement by the Minister of Employment and Labour, Minister Thulas Nxesi, to increase the national minimum wage as from 1 March 2024. We believe that the increase will help to, the value of the minimum wage and to also assist workers to care for their families. I think we must be clear from the outset that the national minimum wage is not a living wage, but it's a process of helping and those who earn very, very low wages and lifting people out of poverty. We may have differences on how we achieve it, but I think we are pleased with the strides that we have made thus far since the implementation of the national minimum wage from 2019 at a base of 20 Rand an hour to now where we stand from 1 March 2024 to about 27 Rand 58 cents per hour, ordinary hour.
Zweli, picking up on that, and the question has always been that are we happy with the strides that have been made since 2019? Are we moving at a pace that is comfortable for the workers, or are we just looking at a tick box exercise?
Well, let's say this. We agree with FEDUSA and Saftus too.
Sure.
Is welcoming the increase of 8.5% announced by the minister. So there is no dispute amongst ourselves here. The point that I was trying to make earlier, which I want to just repeat in the context of Adrew Levy's point and response to some of the points that I'm making, is this. We have to look at wages in South Africa in the context of the levels of poverty in our economy. Now, here's the statistic that I want to quote from the Bureau for Economic Research at the University of Stellenbosch that says, in July of 2022, 75% of workers in South Africa were earning 5,000 or below 5,800. A staggering 75% of workers in this country were earning below 5,800. Now let's take that point further. If you look at the Pietermaritzburg household surveys, or there's the specific NGO that looks at what workers are earning and what is the standards of living. They say if you are in a household of 5 in Johannesburg, you need 5,100 plus to buy a basket of food. 5,100.
Just to last you a month.
Just to last you a month. And that's not your nice middle class, upper middle class. This is the basics of the basic. Mealie, rice, potato. You need 5,000 rands across the country. Durban, you just need 5,000. In Johannesburg, you need 5,100 and something. Now, if 75% of your workers are earning below 5,800, it confirms the point that I was making, that South Africa has been a point where colonialists and the capitalists have been using this country for super exploitation of, in the main, black workers. Now let's look at the impact of this exploitation of black workers. If you look at the Statistics South Africa surveys, they tell us that up to this moment, there's differentials between what white workers earn, what so-called colored Indian workers earn, and what the so-called African workers are earning. One day I'll come back to this debate about why I'm saying so-called Africans. We don't believe that there's something called Africans. Let me just say
conversation
that doesn't include African. That doesn't include the so-called colored workers. We're all Africans, yeah. But because of the racial segregation officially from the government, now we're going to use that term just to illustrate the point. They say, Statistics South Africa, not SAFTU or any other propaganda machinery, they say in this country, a African worker on average earns 6,899. And the so-called Indian and colored workers earn 9,339. And the white workers earn 14,235 rands a month. Now that's just talking about the workers, the differentials that makes us the most unequal society in the world. I don't know this position number 13 that my friend is speaking about. Every economist in the whole world will tell you that South Africa became the most unequal society, in particular during the era between 2014 and 2000 and up to date, basically, with the most unequal society.
All right. Andrew, I'm going to come to you, and especially because I know you don't have that much time with us. Just on the issue of jobs, and that's where we started, that when it was announced in 2019, the national minimum wage, many were saying that it could lead to a job bloodbath. And at this point, what do you make of that? And are we seeing the benefits of the national minimum wage and where we are at this point with the increase that we've just recently seen?
Yes, I will specifically address those, but unfortunately, very quickly, I cannot allow Comrade Vavi's comments to go without challenge. The first thing is, I would be very happy to hear who every single economist in the world is who says we're the most unequal society. And I'm just being empirical and accurate here. I don't doubt that we're very, very, very unequal, but that's not so. And the other thing seems odd to me. On the one hand, he quotes that 75% of the workers earn less than 5,500. So 3/4 earn less than that. But on the other hand, the average black wage, he just quotes is 6,500, which is the third quartile of the distribution. Fact of the matter is that the national minimum wage is set just below the median. And that means that the median wage in South Africa is around 27 Rand an hour. Now, to go to the issue of has there been a jobs bloodbath, the answer is no, there hasn't been in terms of the implementation of the national minimum wage. And bear in mind, we are seeing this against a continuous trend, not of the capitalist exploiters, but of the current government, of decline consistent over the last decade or so, since the Madiba years, in total employment. Now, that was doing that before the national minimum wage, and to the extent that it continues, and indeed will continue, we're not in a position to say, is this because of the national minimum wage? I doubt that it is solely the national minimum wage. Does a national minimum wage have some impact on job creation? I have no doubt that it does. But, you know, you've got to weigh here the conflicting objectives of social policy, of government policy, against pure economic forces. You know, once again, there's no doubt that economic forces operate to the detriment of the least able to protect themselves in the market. And I think we just got to say in passing that the reason people join trade unions is to protect themselves through collective action, and they do that very effectively. The people who are really at the bottom end of the spectrum here are those who unfortunately are not employed and are possibly employed and are not members of trade unions. So we've continued to lose jobs, but I don't think it's fair to say that there's been a jobs bloodbath because of the national minimum wage. Will it lead to further job losses at this level? An 8.5% increase is quite a significant increase, given that the estimates for inflation are not only coming down, but the estimates up until 2029, from about 2026 to 2029, is a steady 4.5%. So that's almost twice, or nearly twice the inflation rate. And of course, it will continue to go up. And the impact of this, and this is a good thing, is it will reduce the wage gap. The only way you can reduce the wage gap that we're reminded so eloquently about is to pay relatively more to the lower paid, and to relatively reduce, not to hold down, but to reduce the rate of increase of the better paid, which includes many of Mr. Vavi's members. So I think as long as we see trade unions pushing for increases of 15% and going on strike at levels like that, then in point of fact, it becomes more difficult. But nonetheless, from a desirability point of view, I think that 8.5 for those who will not find themselves cutting back on jobs because of this is a level which is acceptable. 5,500 Rand a month is a pitiable sum to try and maintain a family on. When you go to Johannesburg restaurants and you see people buying bottles of champagne, French champagne, at 15,000 Rand a bottle, that is very, very distressing. So I think one's got to talk to some extent about who's getting what, and is there more for those who got already at the expense of those who haven't, or do we need to perhaps refocus the nature of our income distribution by, as I say, focusing the lower paid and perhaps holding down the rate of increase, not doing away with it, of the higher paid. One last point I would like to make is that, if you look at the sectors which are least unionized and perhaps the most vulnerable, we have heard mention agricultural workers, but domestic workers. Now, if you want to look at a job creation elasticity versus wage increase, in other words, how many jobs will be lost for a given wage increase, it's got to be almost the most elastic in the domestic sector, because there are many, many homes who give employment to a domestic who suddenly find that having to pay 5,500, whatever the number is, at this stage, when their own wages have not increased in real terms. And in that point, Mr. Vavi is correct. Real wages have not increased. Money wages have, but real wages haven't. It's going to be a step too far. And so those people will find themselves quite possibly out of work. And one's then got to return to this very, very complex good of what is the social benefit versus the cost. Is it better to make sure that those who can get a job may not be, shall we say, exploited, to use that word, but very, very few people will have a job, as opposed to a situation where more people will have jobs, but perhaps not quite as at the level of pay? These are very complex and very difficult questions.
Okay. And I mean, just on that, I want to bring in Ashley. On the issue of just, positive impact of one would say reducing poverty, the issue of inequality levels that we've touched on, but also stimulating the economy and looking back from 2019 to where we are you seeing the positives coming out of this, despite all the setbacks that we might be looking at? Ashley?
Definitely, yes. I think we must understand what was the intention of the introduction of the national minimum wage. It was intended and designed to protect the most vulnerable workers in our society, in particular domestic workers and farm workers. Before the national minimum wage, it was a free-for-all situation, super exploitation of workers. Today, we at least have at 27 Rand 58 cents an hour, which goes a long way to help to cushion the blow of the vulnerable workers in society. As I've mentioned, it could have been better, but I think the challenge is to how do we strike a balance between the aspirations and the needs of workers versus to what the economy can afford, and to create that win-win situation. Yes, we've seen the evidence that the independent research done by the University of Cape Town shows that the introduction of the national minimum wage actually contributed positively to economic development in our country, that those workers earning improved wages do spend that money in the economy on goods and services, and it creates jobs and overall economic development. We think that we are on the right track. We hear the views of Comrade Vavi. We says that it could have been better, but under the current economic climate, we've seen it in other jurisdictions in the world, in the United States of America, Brasilia, and Germany. They have also implemented similar initiatives, and we've seen over a period of time that it contributed positively to both uplifting workers out of abject poverty and also created the much needed boost that the economy needs. So the minimum wage ultimately is a process that we take to improve the lives of the most vulnerable people. And we again welcome the announcement by the Minister to increase as from 1 March 2024.
Zweli, he actually speaking about the process, and I think that is important or key to this conversation, in that we've seen that process from 2019 to where we're going. But do you feel that it's a process that will eventually lead to, I guess, a living wage in good time, or again, politics depending, it might take too long?
It will take too long. Look, 8.5 is an important step, and there's no doubt about it, because 8.5 is just above the official level of inflation. But you must always remember that for workers, inflation is always sitting 3% above the official level of inflation. We talk about somewhere 9-10%. When you look at food inflation in particular, you're talking about sometimes 13% increase of some of the items, or most of the items, 14% in just 1 year. So we're chasing a moving target here. The cost of living in South Africa is escalating. If you look at the cost of transport, the fact that more and more workers are being offloaded from the public transport system into the private transport modes means that increasingly workers are having to spend more of their income on transport, on food, and lesser on clothing, entertainment, and those type of things. And so when you're talking about the context, and I'm refusing to let go of the context, because there's no debate that doesn't have a context. By the way, Mr. Levy, you can Google which is the most unequal society in the world. First thing you will get is a report of the World Bank of October 2022 that says out of 164 countries, number one in terms of the most unequal society is South Africa. There is no debate about this, and so let's not waste our time.
Let's park on that. I think that's a conversation that probably would need its own time to talk about the inequality, because I don't want us to get
sidetracked. But this is the inequalities that we are speaking about here. If you keep so many of your workers below the minimum living levels of living, if they become part of the 30.4 million that live below the upper bound minimum living level in terms of poverty, then it means that you are sitting on a time bomb, 2 time bombs. You're keeping 11.7 million people unemployed, then you're keeping a huge number of people who are employed, but who are regarded as the working poor, because they're earning too low wages for them to really truly turn the wheels of the economy.
But what is at the heart of that, Zweli? And for me, that is the biggest challenge, in that what is at the heart of that? Is it the issue of politics? As simple as that whether the government is failing to get this right or is not willing to get this right?
Look, government is contending with very powerful voices, as you heard in your first insight. People keep on saying to it, you dare move drastically to address the poverty wages of your constituency, which for the ANC used to be the working class. I know that the working class is deserting the ANC left, right, and center. But it used to be its core constituency. They keep on saying that a small increase will lead to job losses, left, right, and center, and you're going to sit with a larger problem. So they always try to find a balance. And the balance now is that minimum wage is around 4,200 rand and way below the 5,800 quoted by the Bureau of Stellenbosch University, and way below even the household survey that is conducted by some of the NGOs, such as the one that I quoted.
And I'm going to come to you, because I know you have to leave the conversation in a very short time. So as your closing comments, but also looking at what needs to be done, to the point that I was talking to Zweli about, in that you have politics come into play into this, whether we like it or not. But again, does it speak to political will or political failures that are leading to this?
You know, I think the first thing we must always bear in mind is that this is an election year, and obviously any government which can say inflation is 4.5%, 5.1%, and we gave you this much more, it helps electioneering. Now, that may be a little bit cynical, but it is a political comment. The real problem, as we've pinned down, is twofold. On the one hand, it is the very low level of earnings for many workers, and let's bear in mind that the median wage in the public sector is over 40,000 rand a month. Compare that to 5,000 national minimum wage. But we equally have 55% plus unemployment. So what we really need is a blend of strategies here to address these dual problems. But unfortunately, until such time as we can lift the level of economic growth in South Africa, that is unlikely to happen. Our growth is abysmal. We are only now getting close to the pre-COVID levels, whereas most other countries have way surpassed it. But it's economic growth that creates jobs, and jobs are created by investment. And as long as those who wish to invest either locally or from international sources don't feel that this is an attractive destination, which is a blend of the politics as well. Let there be no doubt about that. And let's not lose sight of the fact that, and again, I have data in front of me, and I don't seem to be able to confirm Mr. Vavi's assertion that this is what the World Economic Forum says. But let's not forget that we are pretty bad. If we look at the World Economic Forum data, which I happen to know, that out of 127 countries, our labor relations are rated at 127. In other words, we have the worst and the most aggressive and adversarial labor relations system in the world. Now, that's true. That doesn't help us. Equally, when it comes to corruption, we're certainly not the most corrupt country in the world, but we don't have a very proud record. So we need a multi-pronged approach. And equally, that approach has got to encompass incentives for job creation. And again, I would look at the government's job creation program, which was launched nearly 10 years ago, and for the first 5 years didn't create a single job, mainly because it was opposed by not all trade unions, but some of the trade union movement. Mr. Vavi will know who I'm referring to. So we really need a national compact here where business, trade unions from all specters, civil society and government can deal with the single biggest threat. And Mr. Vavi says we're sitting on a time bomb. Indeed we are. But we can only diffuse it, not by, sniping at one another necessarily, not by making broad statements about colonialism or socialism or thisism or thatism, by saying, here's a problem, how can we cooperate to fix it? That's what I would like to see. But in the meantime, with all the difficulties statistically as a labor economist, which surround saying it's, we've lost jobs because of the national wage, or we haven't, I, for one, welcome it, and if it can help the lowest at the bottom end of the scale, while still finding positive strategies to try and encourage and create employment, then it is a good thing.
Andrew, I know you have to leave, but thank you so much for coming through to speak to us. Adrew Levy, who's a Labour analyst, but we continue our conversation with Ashley and Zwelinzima Vavi. Ashley, I want to come to you then, and again to the points that Andrew was making in terms of solutions to make sure that this works better, and it works to a point where we as South Africans know that the workers are well taken care of. What would those solutions be?
Well, we must acknowledge that the national minimum wage is a process. We must agree that if we try to radically increase the minimum wage, let's say for argument's sake, if we want to increase it by 20% or 25%, we must be certain that it will have unintended consequences. There certainly will be casualties in the form of job losses, and that's not the intention that we wanted to create. The intention initially is to improve the livelihoods of the most vulnerable workers, taking them out of abject poverty, and also creating the much needed jobs in the economy. While the statistics shows that the minimum wage and the increases thus far is on the right track, there is no compelling evidence that it led to job losses or otherwise economic a downward spiral. So therein lies the challenge. How do we move forward in increasing the livelihoods and the lives of vulnerable workers without doing injury or causing injury to the economy, which is already in dire straits? I think we must not underestimate the impact that COVID-19 had on our economy and society. Over 3 million workers lost their jobs as a result of COVID-19, and in some respects, in some sectors of the economy, has not recovered from that pandemic. So we need to find the right balance. I agree with Comrade Vavi. The stats that Comrade Vavi quoted is true. It's right, But unfortunately, the reality shows otherwise. We've
All
got
right.
to take a careful approach. We all believe in the aspirations to improve the lives of the most vulnerable, but I think we must take a sober approach as to how we get there and the process that we take. But let me just say the following.
Very quickly, we are out of time, but very quickly and very briefly, if you may. Go ahead, Ashley.
Let me just say that as producer, we are worried about the levels of non-compliance to the minimum wage. We are aware of employers that just totally disregard the minimum wage, and we believe that government is not doing their job 100%. We need to see greater enforcement to ensure that workers who is intended to benefit from the minimum wage, that they actually benefit. And those employers who fails to pay, they must be taken to task by government. And that's our next challenge that we want to work with the social partners in government to ensure that there's maximum compliance with the national minimum wage. Thank you.
Thank you, Ashley. Zweli, in conclusion, and I would have loved to deal with that issue of compliance, but we are out of time. Just your closing comments on the issue, but also looking ahead to this and how we can improve to make things better for workers.
Well, the context again. 1% of the population of this country owns 45% of the wealth. 10% of the population of this country owns 90% of the wealth. The critical question we all should be asking is, when will redistribution of wealth from the rich to the poor happen? When we take very conservative, modest approaches within the labor movement that says this halfway loaf is better than nothing. The reality is that South Africa sits with the most unequal wages between its executive
but then it goes
and
back
the workers.
To the political challenges that
it goes to the willingness.
Yes.
The point that we're making, you're absolutely correct. If we have a government that refuses to look at the reality of growing inequalities, where actually the opposite of distribution of wealth from the rich to the poor have happened, that actually when you look at the introduction of VAT, and when you look at the austerity program, and when you're looking at the interest rates regime in South Africa, the reality is that we have turned the whole thing upside down. We are distributing wealth from the poor
to the rich.
The rich is getting stinking rich, and the poor remains trapped in poverty. That's the debate. The national minimum wage must be situated, not in some. It's better. We've lifted 6 million people out of doldrums. No, you are not addressing the reality of South Africa, that we are the most unequal society, and that we have not redistributed wealth from the rich to the poor. Instead, we have done the opposite.
So, Nxesi Vavi, we're out of time, but thank you so much for coming through to speak to us. And also, Ashley Benjamin, thank you to you too. Thank you also to Adrew Levy, Labour analyst, who was with us a little bit earlier on. I had to go, but let's park it there as far as this conversation is concerned. We do have more updates and headlines that are just coming to us.